We were doing such good. We were keeping vandals off the streets. We were keeping young people occupied. They were glued to the radios instead of out wrecking phone boxes and robbing cars and all sorts of things.
On June the 4th, 2016, the legendary Irish pirate radio operator Eamon Cooke died.
I think for many people, while he was alive, they were frightened of him.
It shows the power that he held over his victims and the fear they had of him. That it was only after his death that they felt empowered to come forward.
But unlike the many notable broadcasters who had gained their first taste of fame on his station, Radio Dublin, Cooke was a legend for all the wrong reasons.
Eamon Cooke certainly is up there among the rogues gallery of child molesters in this country. A wicked, evil, manipulative, sociopathic predator.
He'd systematically been abusing young girls for decades, many on the premises of Radio Dublin, and had been convicted for his crimes in 2007.
The really terrible thing about this is that we have no idea how many victims there are of Eamon Cooke and how many lives he's destroyed.
But within days of his death, his name was linked to one of the most notorious and baffling missing person cases in the history of the state: the disappearance of teenager Philip Cairns. A witness now claims that the boy was murdered by Cooke in Radio Dublin, his body dumped the same day. What really happened the day the 13-year-old went missing? Why and how could he have ended up nearly 5 miles from his home with a man he didn't know in such a well-known place? And could the pirate pedophile have committed an act of murder?
He was an absolute monster. He was a vicious psychopath and a predator, a rapist, a paedophile. He was just the worst human being you could ever imagine. So do I think he's capable of murdering a child and covering it up? I most certainly do.
Dublin in the early 1970s. In terms of entertainment, options were limited.
My memories of Dublin are still in black and white. There was foreign TV, UK TV coming in, but it still felt like a little rock on the edge of Europe. You've got to remember that young people's relationship with radio in the 70s and 80s was totally different to what it is now, because it was the only game in town. There was no internet, there were no video games. Basically, you were stuck at home, and what you did was listen to the radio.
In terms of radio stations, options were even more limited. In Ireland, there was only one choice. Radio Dublin was one of the stations to stay the course. Don Moore first met Eamon Cooke when he rambled into his TV repair shop.
I met Eamon Cooke way back in about 1972. I was always fascinated by radios since I was a kid. And there was a repair shop for TVs and radios in Thomas Street. And I was probably 19 or 20 wandering by. And I rambled into the shop, which was full of TVs. But very interestingly, it had a taxi radio receiver in the corner. And this fascinated me more than anything, because I was pretending to be interested in the conversation with this little man, Eamon Cooke, and at the same time I was listening to the radio with the taxi messages.
To avoid the attention of the Gardaí and the Department of Posts and Telegraphs, the station moved from house to house, eventually ending up at Cooke's house in Inchicore, where he lived with his wife, Joan, the second of 3 wives he would have in his life.
He always liked to be the controller, and he loved the attention. And I think it gave him a certain feeling of being somebody.
A fallout between Cooke and Don Moore led to the establishment of another pirate, ARD. Cooke had built his own transmitter, effectively shutting his previous associates out of Radio Dublin.
I decided I'd go and visit Cooke. And I knocked on his door and I asked him what he was playing at, because at this point I knew. When he answered the door, he was surrounded by children. I always remember that. And I thought they might have been his brother's kids, his cousins. But I distinctly remember a gathering of kids around him. I wasn't a tough guy, but I was from Ballyfermot, so I could pretend to be tough. And I remember telling him quite clearly that that transmitter and that signal and that frequency is mine. He will not take it away.
When Moore arrived at Sarsfield Road to confront Cooke, his real personality came through.
And his answer was, shall I get a gun and I go over and I shoot you? And I said, you'll probably go to jail for that. And he said, it wouldn't be the first time.
Cooke was an unlikely radio boss.
Eamon Cooke's a curious guy. His background wasn't in broadcasting, his background was in electronics, and that stood him to great stead later on when he did get involved with Radio Dublin.
He was born and bred in Glasnevin. He was actually, as a teenager, he was convicted of explosive offences.
His background was a very ultra-Republican family, as they're his words. He got involved on the fringes of the IRA, was in trouble with the guards and was banged up both in Mountjoy and Portlaoise.
And he apparently talked about it with great pride, you know, his IRA connections and whatnot throughout his life.
Despite this criminal record, Cooke bizarrely ingratiated himself with the Gardaí, popping up at the most unusual times.
I came across him first around 1969, 1970. I was sent into the city on the crime task force, one of the first crime task forces, a uniform task force, and I was a motorcycle guarder, and that's where I first came across this strange, exotic man called Eamon Cooke.
Any street guard in the early 70s would be quite well acquainted with Eamon Cooke. Eamon Cooke used to patrol the streets at night in this Jaguar car of his. He had a CB radio and he'd be listening into the Garda calls, monitoring them, and the calls to the ambulance.
He was well known to, especially those of us in the South City of Dublin, and the dispatchers in Dublin Castle actually afforded him his own code sign he was called Alpha 7.
On the Jaguar, he had this crash bar built into the front of it, where he could ram cars. And it was hard to believe this was actually going on, because of course I went home to bed like everybody else. But he could tell me about domestic disputes, factories going on fire, car crashes, things that were going on, because he was listening to the police calls.
He seemed to have a fascination, especially with scenes where violence had been used. You'd often arrive at a scene to find him there before you.
He'd tune into the police radios, which were far easier to listen into those days than they are now. They weren't scrambled back then. And he would go off in pursuit of suspects. He was a Walter Mitty character. That was a very, very strange thing to do.
He dressed like a vagrant. You know, he didn't look the part. I thought there was something weird about him. I always felt there was something not quite right about him.
He's a small, wizened little man. I say one word that best describes him as sleazy.
Eamon Cooke's physical appearance seems to have been particularly unattractive.
He struck me as a strange character in that he didn't seem to be very clean. I don't know if that makes sense, but his appearance was shoddy. His shirt collar, for instance, was quite grimy with dirt.
I met him briefly in 1983, and he was smelly. That's a horrible thing to say. His personal hygiene wasn't great. He looked dishevelled.
Everything about Cooke was shabby. He was always unkempt. His clothes were always like he picked them up in second-hand clothes shops.
Smoked like a trooper, didn't drink. My wife called him Dirty Shirty because he always had a black mark on his shirt, as if he fell asleep in his shirt and jacket and woke up and just carried on.
A dirty, smelly elfler who sat in the house with a suit on him, a dirty suit, dirty, filthy fingernails, and never, ever lifted his eyes, just spoke to you with his eyes closed.
Radio Dublin was typical of the stations of the era. Run down, second-hand or borrowed equipment in a run-down premises.
The building itself was kind of crumbling because of potential raids from the department. Windows were blocked, doors were blocked. There was just stuff scattered everywhere.
It would have been what you might call a set of double decks, which would be used for a mobile DJ unit. Some tape recorders, some cassette recorders, microphone, basic, very basic, nothing much at all.
You kind of get the sense that it was a home, it was a radio station, it was a junkyard, it was all kinds of things rolled into one, but basically it was just a mess.
Absolutely a bit of a kip and sort of equipment that seemed to be strung together, but it seemed to work. It sounded okay on air.
In many senses, Radio Dublin was a free-for-all.
There were lots of youngish girls there, 16 or 17, volunteers manning the phones and taking requests and that kind of thing.
At any one moment in time, you would have people living in the house, you'd have disc jockeys on air, you'd have their pals around, you'd have people mitching off school. You just have anything.
My programme was in the evening, so I arrived up there around about 7:30, went on air at 8 o'clock in the evening time. So there mightn't have been as many at that stage, but I was there during the day on one or two occasions, and there were several children there. Now, when I say children, I mean people of the age, they were probably teenage children, not younger than teenage, but there would be several of them, boys and girls.
I was there loads and loads of occasions, and whenever you'd walk in 24/7, there'd be people there. The radio would be on, there'd be broadcasting, the kettle would be on. It was always a buzz, a very messy buzz.
Certainly I remember in Radio Dublin, there could have been a dozen young kids sat around. Some might have been doing programmes, most were answering the telephones, which were just ringing off the wall. It was all requests for kids who were madly in love with whoever. And sometimes it felt like a bit of a crash in there. I mean, there was a lot of kids that come, you know, in their school gear. I do remember going in one day at about 5:30. There was 2 or 3, I'd say 14 or 15-year-olds in their convent outfits. And one of those I know, sort of Cooke regularly used to sort of take home in his car.
Radio Dublin had become a success, catering to a young market hungry for music and satisfied by the non-stop pop and endless chatter which Cooke's station had to offer. In early 1978, rumours began circulating in Radio Dublin about the boss's behaviour. In particular, his unusual friendships with young girls, who sometimes hung around the station.
People in the radio station knew he was fiddling with kids. Absolutely.
The allegation was that these children had been abused, that these children had been sexually abused. That's the allegation.
People like James Dillon were deeply suspicious of Cooke's activities. Dillon decided to leave Radio Dublin and set up a rival station, Big D.
It was brought to my attention that a 14-year-old was made aware from a 9-year-old that something had happened. It seemed it was of a sexual nature. The concern was that if there was any misunderstanding, that now it would damage both the radio station and Eamon Cooke's reputation. On the other hand, if it was true, then the DJs in the station were being used as a type of magnet to bring children in for abuse, basically. I needed, first of all, to prove to myself that it was true. I needed to establish that fact. You know, you might say it wasn't really my place to establish it, but I wanted to know before I took any action. And I got the 14-year-old to make a recording to establish with the 9-year-old, just to repeat what was said previously, to establish, was there anything in it? I didn't let anybody else hear the tape. After she came back, I took it home and listened to it. What was very clear was an adult was going to great lengths to manipulate a child, and I was 100% convinced that he was up to something really bad.
Cooke was in Spain. He'd been given a holiday by an advertiser. He flew back into Dublin Airport, and was met at arrivals with a fait accompli.
I met him at the airport and told him that he'd brought this on himself by interfering with the children, by using the radio station as some kind of a magnet, and that whatever happened from there was on his shoulders.
As far as he's concerned, the ringleaders, James Dillon and Jerry Campbell, were basically, that was it. They were cut off, and with them could go most of his talent. And you're talking big talent here. People like Dave Fanning, there was Marty Whelan, John Clark, Dennis Murray. That they could just go, and he would start all over again, because he was an amazing narcissist. It was really all about Cooke. I mean, he was the captain.
I knew that he was going to come back, deny everything, and intimidate as many people as possible, because I figured that was his modus operandi. And that's pretty much what he did.
The captain was furious, particularly that his interference with children was one of the reasons for Dillon's departure and the establishment of Big D.
Oh, he was absolutely incensed. He was raging. And he also played a bit of the martyr, which was kind of interesting as well. A very strange man, Eamon Cooke.
Cooke took to the air to defend his position and to condemn the treachery of his former employees.
As everyone out there will say, well, there's no smoke without a little bit of fire. And what can one do? How does one disprove this type of allegation? That children were allowed into Radio Dublin and were molested. Yes, they were the allegations laid down against me personally, that children were allowed into this radio station here and were indecently molested. That was the actual allegation. All I could do, of course, was deny it and ask for proof.
He probably felt that by going on and actually saying what he was accused of, the public could think, well, if he's actually said that, it couldn't be true, or he wouldn't have said it.
Very weird, because he would play this victim, like as if he were the victim. And that's what he did on that broadcast.
James Dillon went to Cooke again. This time, the captain's response was more disturbing.
The second time that I approached Cooke and told him I believed that he was a child abuser and that he could go on the air and pretend all he liked, but I believed it, and history will show that you are. And his reaction was he threatened to see me 6 foot under.
And that is where the matter was left. Fear of Cooke apparently stopped his victims from complaining, but the culture of the time didn't help.
I think it's also worth pointing out that in 1979, there was no sexual abuse, either sort of church or private individuals. These were not discussions that people had. A 16, 17-year-old boy working for Radio Dublin would not have been looking for signs. Nobody said really what inappropriate behaviour was. If you now had a man of his age maybe taking a 16-year-old girl, home somewhere or driving her back from a shift, working at Radio Dublin, you say that's probably inappropriate for a man of his age to be in a car with a 15-year-old on his own. I would certainly not do that myself, be with a girl who's 15 on my own. Back then, well, it was just being nice and dropping her home.
For Cooke, there were scores to be settled and new enemies to be confronted. But no amount of protests or departures seemed to be able to stop the predator. And much worse was to come. By the end of the 1970s, 43-year-old Eamon Cooke was running Radio Dublin, one of the most successful pirates in the country. The station had survived on air, despite the departure of almost all of its staff in protest at the owner's continuing molestation of young girls, many of whom had been allowed to hang around the station. Eamon Cooke was proud of Radio Dublin and what he considered its role in the community.
We were doing such good. We were keeping vandals off the streets. We were keeping young people occupied. They were glued to the radios instead of out wrecking phone boxes and robbing cars and all sorts of things.
But real competition for Radio Dublin had arrived in the form of the more sophisticated and professional Sunshine Radio, run by ex-Radio Caroline Englishmen Robbie Robinson and Chris Carey.
Cooke was obviously very Republican, did not like the Brits, took a grave exception to having his territory. Now, he thought it was his personal fiefdom, the airwaves in Dublin.
Then, one night, Sunshine's equipment was mysteriously sabotaged.
The mast, the transmission mast, was sabotaged. It was always believed that Eamon Cooke was behind that action.
Some people say, and Robbie would say, a small piece of dynamite. And it was Radio Dublin, it was Eamon who went out there and cut the mast down.
Fearing for his safety, having heard Cooke had boasted of IRA connections, Carey fled town.
Robbie persevered. Carey disappeared.
When he returned to establish the super pirate Radio Nova, Carey offered an olive branch to his harshest critic, lauding him as a radio legend in an on-air interview.
Asia, and only time will tell. Nova News follows at 7, and the report tonight, it's Dave Harvey talking to the granddaddy of commercial radio in Dublin, Eamon Cooke. And Jason's on at 7:30. Good night.
Been in radio for some little time now. Radio is the main preoccupation.
You were born in Dublin?
Born in Dublin, Glasnevin. Moved to Inchicore in 1961. I was a clerk. I worked in the civil service. I worked for the post office. Decent people. And I've been around here, there and yonder. I ran an electrical and radio contracting business there for a few years, about 15 years.
So what do you want to do in the future?
And again, I'd like to stay in the background on radio. I'd never like to be in the forefront. But I would like to keep track of listeners' likes and dislikes.
Cooke's activities as a pirate became more brazen. He even rebroadcast RTE's main news bulletins, seeking permission from the state broadcaster to do so at one stage.
DJs would stop and up would come the RTE news. And then RTE wrote to him and said, you know, cease and desist. And he wrote a very, very wordy reply back saying that he would cease to broadcast. I think it was the lunchtime news, but he would still do the evening news instead.
And right across the early 1980s, Cooke continued to interfere with children.
He seemed to be empowered for some reason. It was almost as if he was untouchable. He always had that untouchable thing. Now, whether he actually got more confidence because he wasn't apprehended or not, I'm not sure, but probably yes. I think he probably got worse.
Gardaí in South County Dublin have issued an appeal for a 13-year-old boy missing from his home in the Rathfarnham area.
On the afternoon of the 23rd of October 1986, 13-year-old Philip Cairns left his home in Ballyrone, South County Dublin, to go back to school after his lunch break. He was never seen again.
He disappeared, and it was a huge mystery. There was a lot of searching done in the area. They searched the paths and roads he might have used to go back to the school, his regular haunts. His family had said that he never went off before. Anytime he was going anywhere, he'd always report where he was going.
His disappearance sparked a major manhunt at the beginning of an investigation which was to last 3 decades.
I arrived home, I think it was about 7:15, and my eldest daughter, Mary, who had come home just previously in the evening, and she discovered that Philip wasn't home, and she knew that he would be due home around 4:15. So, and as soon as she was waiting for me at the door, and she said, "Philip is not home yet, Mammy."
His mother raised the alarm because she had contacted a few neighbours when she came home and discovered that he hadn't returned to school in the afternoon. We were told, and it was an immediate alert. There was always an immediate alert when a child went missing.
There was no resources spared. We worked round, well, I won't say round the clock, but almost round the clock. We worked 12, 14, 18-hour days. There was absolutely unlimited resources. We had visits from the Commissioner encouraging the teams to keep at it, because the abduction of a child, a 13-year-old child, was something that was it was not in our textbooks. It was one of the most intense, detailed, call it devoted. Men and women went above and beyond the call of duty because we felt personally affected. It was our area. We had children at schools in the area, and we were also, I was as a detective, this could happen again.
It was very big at the beginning and was for a long time. It caught the imagination of the public. There was huge sympathy for his family, huge interest in his whereabouts, and the family were very good at keeping up the pressure as well.
It changed the atmosphere, even how parents looked after their children. That carefree days of watching your children amble harmlessly off to school. That Philip Cairns abduction ended at that age. People were frightened.
From the start, the Cairns case was very unusual. Philip was a quiet, reserved, studious boy. Not the sort to take it upon himself to go missing. And he had simply vanished into thin air. The matter took a most unusual twist when his school bag was discovered placed in a laneway days later.
Gardaí were certain they had checked that area before. There was no bag there then, so it had been left shortly before it was found, they reckoned. And they reckoned it was probably put there to set off a false trail.
Despite having to deal with dozens of alleged sightings and hundreds of theories about Philip's whereabouts and fate, Gardaí have never given up on the case, despite frequent renewed appeals for information across the years.
When the weeks and the months went by and there was no sign of Philip Cairns, well, I certainly, for one, and I know my senior colleagues in the incident room, we felt maybe this is the beginning. We hadn't heard much about serial abductors or serial killers, but it was in our head at the time that perhaps Philip was going to be the first. So we were always concerned of that.
While most observers believed and still believe he was abducted by a sexual predator, many of the theories about Philip's disappearance bordered on the bizarre.
Yeah, it got totally out of hand, yeah. I mean, people were even named as to who might have been involved, and all of it was totally false. And people were talking about different rings of people that might have been operating at the time, pedophile rings. People were talking about he could have been abducted by some cult. It was all bizarre claims, and none of them founded in truth.
I spent the Halloween in the Dublin Mountains beside the Hellfire Club with 2 carloads of armed men waiting for an incident that we were told was going to happen, that Philip was alive and that he was going to be sacrificed in the Hellfire Club or in its environs. That's extraordinary. We took it that serious and we stayed up there. I'll never forget it. It was a weird and a strange with the mist coming down in the hills, and I had to pinch myself that what we were doing was police work. This is how far we were prepared to go, that we couldn't, like any good investigator, ignore even the wildest theories.
Meanwhile, Eamon Cooke's predatory habits finally caught up with him in the early 2000s.
When I saw his name, I could not believe. I had to check it with an old colleague of mine. Is this the same Alpha 7? That was his code sign. And it came as a bombshell to me, and hearing the harrowing accounts of what he did to those children.
I tried to avoid this moment, as you might imagine. Not use the speaker.
As local radio began to dominate the media scene, Radio Dublin, now an irrelevance, lived on. In 1996, an uncharacteristically dapper Cooke attended a 30-year anniversary for the station.
I'm going with staff here from way back.
At the time, he was known to be still abusing children.
If you can stay with us another 5 years, we'll have another of these events. In the meantime, enjoy yourself for the night and maybe tune into the station every now and then. Thanks for coming.
Over the previous decade and before, numerous formal complaints had been made to the Gardaí by his victims.
The really terrible thing about this is that we have no idea how many victims there are of Eamon Cooke. and how many lives he's destroyed.
In 2003, Cooke was convicted for attempted rape, attempted unlawful carnal knowledge, and sexual and indecent assault of 4 girls. But the conviction was later quashed on a legal technicality. He was released in May 2006, but was brought again to court, and this time there was no escape.
I gave evidence in both of those court cases. The evidence was important because it established that the girl who was 29 in the dock was 9 at the time, and that she didn't just invent this, that some adult, basically me, believed her at the time and took action.
In 2007, he was finally convicted of 42 counts of child abuse, absolutely horrific in nature. These are one of the worst that's ever come across. I've talked to people that actually covered the trial, and they said he was just, his behaviour throughout the trial was absolutely sickening. He did his best to disconcert his victims throughout their evidence.
He began his sentence aged 71. Most who knew him presumed and hoped that was the last they'd ever see or hear of him.
For a lot of them, they felt a sense of relief, of huge relief. And not so much that he was in prison, but that he was off the streets and could not abuse again.
Eamon Cooke was locked up, and for many of his victims, the ordeal was over. But it was only his impending death that would lead to the most extraordinary revelation about the paedophile pirate. Serial sexual predator and former radio station owner Eamon Cooke was sentenced to 10 years for his crimes in 2007.
Nice to see them along as well. If you can
Up to the late 1990s, Cooke had been abusing children with impunity.
in the meantime, enjoy yourself for the night.
He remained something of a cult figure in the radio industry, and had even accepted the plaudits of those who attended Radio Dublin's 30th anniversary party. Most people who knew him, and his victims who feared and hated him, felt justice had in some way been done and that they would never see or hear of him again. But like so many times in the past, Eamon Cooke had not gone away.
Nobody had heard anything from Eamon Cooke in years. He had faded from the headlines. He was rotting away in a prison cell, exactly where he deserved to be. And then this bombshell news that he had actually been linked to the disappearance of Philip Cairns, one of the most high-profile missing persons case in the whole country. Now, Eamon Cooke, the monster that is Eamon Cooke, was linked to this missing child.
Close to death, Cooke was being moved from his prison cell in Arbour Hill to a hospice for palliative care. Angela Copley, a community worker and confidant of Cooke's estranged wife, Jane, received a call.
I got a phone call, first of all, from Jane telling me that she had got a phone call from the governor in Arbour Hill to tell her Cooke was in the Mater Hospital and he was going to the hospice. And Jane said to him, "Why are you ringing me? Why are you telling me?" And he said, "Because you're his next," she was down as his next of kin. She actually did not believe, and she thought he was faking an illness. I really think that he was going to come out and get her, because he did threaten he was going to kill her.
In a phone call to another of Cooke's victims, something extraordinary was revealed.
In the course of the conversation I had with her, she told me that a sergeant had told her, she said to me, "There's a sting in the tail here," naming this sergeant, and he had told her that in 2011, naming a certain person who was a victim of Cooke, went into Rathfarnham and said that she threw this school bag over the wall. And I said to her, "Jesus, you better be telling me the truth, because you know what I'm going to do with this now." And she said, I am, I wouldn't lie to you. And I hate even saying this now publicly about her, because she's not a liar, do you know? But what she was saying to me got me so, all I could think of when she said the school bag was Mrs. Cairns.
We don't know why Cooke wasn't interviewed about the allegations when they were made. But with the 79-year-old on his deathbed, the clock was ticking.
I got very aggressive at one stage to the guards because I thought they should go flying up to the hospice and they should grab him and shake it out of him.
That a serial predator like Cooke might be linked in some way to the most baffling missing persons case in Irish history has set the media alight.
Maybe all this publicity will bring a breakthrough, a real breakthrough in the case, but as of now, I'm sceptical.
But what substance could there be to the suggestions made by the girl who went to the Gardaí? The report, which centres around Philip's bag, also claims that Philip Cairns was at Radio Dublin on the day of his disappearance, that Eamon Cooke attacked him, probably killing him.
She was in Radio Dublin. She walked into a room, she saw Philip Cairns bleeding. She passed out and she woke up in the car on her way home.
Apart from the witness claims that she actually saw Philip Cairns being attacked, there are a number of sides to the story which ring true to a number of people who knew Eamon Cooke and what he was capable of.
I think the only thing that surprises me about Cooke now is that nothing surprises me. I would feel if Philip Cairns is a victim of Eamon Cooke, he's probably not the only one that's been killed by him.
Like every young child, Philip would have been fascinated by the glamour of a radio station, even one as run down and disorganised as Radio Dublin. He might have been persuaded to come for a visit.
I think he used the radio station as a magnet and could have said something as simple as, would you like to have a look at the station? It's not far away from here. I think that's possible.
While it's unlikely Cooke would have travelled from Inchicore to Rathfarnham in the early afternoon, he did have a house nearby, or he may have been in the area at one of his transmitter sites.
Cooke, we do know, lived not too far away as well. He had a place in the Tala area, which is very, very close in proximity to where Philip Cairns lived in Ballyroan Road.
Cooke did drive around with people in the car, quite often children, and I think that probably would have made him look less threatening to anybody, a young person being approached.
It's also been stated by many commentators that Cooke was only interested in young girls. But now there is evidence that he also abused boys. This puts Philip firmly in his target grouping.
There's evidence, clear evidence, that he wasn't selective, whether it was male or female.
Everything is plausible when you're dealing with the likes of Cooke. The fact that people said that, that Cooke molested young girls and not young boys, that's just folly in relation to a person who has the mindset to molest anybody.
Whilst it might appear that Philip didn't fit the profile of his victims, at the same time he's young and vulnerable, and that would be the criteria, I'd imagine, that a predator like Cooke would work on. And from that basis, then, no child is safe, be they male or female.
On the other side of the argument, Philip was a quiet, reserved child. Someone unlikely to go off with strangers and unlikely to have travelled to somewhere like Inchicore on his own.
Philip Cairns was a very, very quiet child, and he wasn't jumping on buses and running into town, into radio studios.
Eamon Cooke moved around in a very distinctive Jaguar car. Unless he was driving a different vehicle, it's unlikely he lured Philip into his car in broad daylight.
His car, his transport will be known. A child with a uniform from St. Enda's. It doesn't make any sense to me.
And regardless of his violent past, how likely is it that Cooke would have attacked a young boy in a busy radio station during the afternoon?
Why would Eamon Cooke, if he had vile and horrible intentions and had a desire to hurt that child or to interfere or to predate on him, why would he bring him into the studios in front of so many?
But what substance could there be to the suggestions?
Certain parts of what was said have been corroborated by Cooke himself in the hospice. Now, this is vital and very, very important, because no matter what people say, you must look for corroboration in relation to it, and we have that.
And what about Philip's school bag? The most unusual thing about this whole case is the fact that the bag appeared days later. If Eamon Cooke killed Philip and then disposed of his body, would he, as the witness claims, have wanted the bag to reappear?
It's still a mystery. There was all kinds of theories flying around. Was it somebody trying to throw the investigation team off the trail of the culprit? But what could he have gained? What possible gain could he have?
Perhaps if he was responsible, he may have panicked. He had the school bag, didn't know what to do with it, and thought the handiest thing might be to do is to get somebody to bring it back to near the house, somewhere between the house and the school. And it's alleged that he bullied either one or maybe two girls to go there and dump it there.
I could never understand why the bag was brought back. It made no sense. Why not bury it with Philip, or why not dump it somewhere where it would never be found again, or why not burn it?
But if DNA from the bag can be linked to the woman who says she left it there, we'll be a step closer to knowing the truth. It's unlikely, however, to provide definitive proof that Cooke killed Philip Cairns.
If there's little rumours here, there and yonder, I do seek out here, there and yonder at strange hours of day and night. Of course, I could pop up here, there and everywhere, and have done.
For over 30 years, Eamon Cooke was an integral part of the Irish pirate radio scene. His voice was a familiar sound on his own radio station. Many believe he made a contribution to the development of Irish radio. Any contribution, however, is far outweighed by his pernicious, violent and predatory treatment of vulnerable children.
When he was being sentenced for raping girls, young girls, for people whose lives he ruined, one of them shouted at him in the court, "I hope you rot in hell," and that's all he deserves.
The one thing about paedophiles, it's nearly correct right across the board, is that they do not believe what they're doing is wrong. And that's a huge problem. Because if somebody commits a crime like a murder, perhaps a crime of passion, they will feel remorse at a very short time, and they can be rehabilitated into society. Not everybody, but most of them can. With paedophiles, very rarely, because as far as they're concerned, there's nothing, they're doing nothing wrong, and they can't see what the fuss is all about. And there lies a huge, huge problem. And in relation to Cooke and his arrogance in relation to all these matters, it would be typical that he could never be rehabilitated. Death took him away from what he was doing.
He was an absolute monster. He was a vicious psychopath and a predator, a rapist, a paedophile. He was just the worst human being you could ever imagine. So do I think he's capable of murdering a child and covering it up? I most certainly do.
What we do know about Eamon Cooke is disturbing and disgusting. And while we may never know the real truth, his pattern of behaviour over many decades indicates that he is someone who could very likely be involved in the disappearance and death of Philip Cairns.
He was well capable of it. When you see the stories that came out about the way he abused youngsters, the way he nurtured them and brought them along, and then finally abused them in his own home, he was well fit, well capable of doing it.
I think Eamon Cooke was capable of pretty much anything. I think, obviously, the circumstances surrounding the Philip Cairns disappearance still isn't clear, but it certainly, to me, sounds like somebody as evil as Eamon Cooke was probably behind it.